mobility and less so mobility has been always in the focus of social and historical analysis of Mongolian societies, given their nomadic way of life and their political appearance in various parts of Eurasia. The Mongol Empire in particular has continuously attracted much attention concerning its expansion rate and its abilities of establishing a Pax Mongolica, или Mongolska civilizacja, in a relatively short period of time. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongols not only launched an early state formation of their own polity, but expanded their hegemony within decades over China, Central Asia, Persia, Caucasia, Eastern Europe, and Siberia. Culturally very diverse areas that now became closely interconnected. If you may call this a success story in medieval empire building, then mobility was surely playing a decisive role. The question is, how can we measure mobility? How does it reify? Accordingly, there is a need to define the capacities and limitations of mobility. In this talk, I shall readdress some better and lesser known topics from the medieval Mongolian world related to mobility in a wider sense, before I will turn to the epistemological arenas of culture transfer and briefly to long-distance trade. In the first part, the dialectics of mobility and immobility will be discussed as social and cultural mobility in terms of career making, loyalty, integration, ethnicity, descent, genealogies, marriage, and religion. The second part will focus on spatial mobility in terms of military service and tribute relations, cultural transfer and traveling ideas, movement control and population transfer, the flow of restriction of goods. According to a convenient definition, social mobility means the movement in time of individuals, families, or other social units between positions of varying advantage in the system of social stratification of a society, end quote. This includes class, status groups, kinship units, social origins, and thus providing us with an analytic tool also for societies of a distant past. The relevance of social and spatial mobility for the late Middle Ages in Europe is unquestioned, and even less so for the expanding Mongol Empire with its comparatively weaker institutional boundaries and its higher degree of cultural diversity. A well-known example of career making and loyalty is reported in the secret history under the year 1206, when Temujin was proclaimed Khagan of all Mongols. Then, still at an early stage of state formation, Genghis Khan reformed the military organization fundamentally. Judging over his enemies and allies, he said, "To those who cited me when I was establishing our nation, I shall express my appreciation, and having formed units of 1,000, I shall appoint them commanders of 1,000, end quote. Besides loyalty, proficiency and leadership in matters of warfare represented prior selection criteria, where ethnic belonging ranked further down, subordinate even to family and kinship types. Reorganizing his former favorites or bodyguards, Geschickten, Genghis Khan set up one Tumen selected from 95 Mingan, chosen from among the sons of his commanders and the common people according to their combat skills. And he was crystal clear in his orders to his newly appointed commanders on how to choose men for the military service. When guards will be recruited for us and the sons of commanders of 10,000, of 1,000, and of 100, or the sons of ordinary people will enter our service, those shall be recruited from who are able and of good appearance, and who are deemed suitable to serve by our sides, end quote. The Geschichten was a vanguard of multi-ethnic composition, ranking above normal troops, which consisted of 3 departments. The privileged night watch, kept Gül, counting 1 Mingan, the archers or quiver bearers, Horchen, also 1 Mingan, and the 8 Mingan of the day watch, Dorgaut. Jormagan Horchi, a high-ranking officer from the 2nd department, made a remarkable career. Originating from the Sunnite clan of the Ötiken Mongols, he was first decorated by Genghis Khan after the siege of Urgench in 1221. Then Ögedei Khan sent him to Persia in 1229, where he became famous for conquering Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia in the 1230s, being himself not a member of the ruling Bojigid lineage. The same selection criteria were applied in the administrative and cultural hemispheres of the Mongol Empire, emphasizing the very principles of integration by difference. Examples of those who are able and of good appearance and made their way to the upper echelon of the imperial elite, irrespectively of ethnic or class belonging, are abundant. Famous judge Yarguchi Shigi Hutucho, responsible for the compilation of the Mongol code Yasa since 1206, was a Tatar child of noble origin when adopted into Temujin's family around 1182-83, thus becoming a stepbrother of Genghis Khan. According to his order, Shigi Hutuchte, as many Tatar nobles, was to learn Uyghur script, most probably from Tatar Tunga, a Naiman Daruga, who entered the service of Genghis Khan and introduced the script for official purposes after the defeat of this Turkic-speaking people in 1204. Not without reason, Shigi Hutuchte's biography is depicted in greater detail by yet another eminent, almost contemporary retainer of the empire, the great historian and statesman Rashid ad-Din. Born into a Jewish family of Hamadan in northwest Persia, he converted to Islam by the age of 30 and entered the court of the Ilkhanids as a physician, becoming an influential advisor to Mustafa Khan, and later a vizier to Mahmud Ghazan and Urjit. Indeed, Rashid ad-Din has been given the credits for designing and implementing the reforms of Ghazan Khan on the basis of Iranian traditions. A revealing indication of immobility has been often mentioned, namely that the Mongols could conquer the world on horseback, but that it cannot be ruled from a horse, as Ögedei Khan was told. Their main strategy was in fact limited to the extraction of resources and taxes from a peasant population, urban dwellers, and merchants. To this aim, their rulers were flexible enough to adopt to local experience, to integrate culture techniques or governmental expertise, from the region and change official faith either to Christianity, Buddhism, or Islam when necessary. But by doing so, the Mongol elite underwent culture change in various directions too. The dynamics of expansion and conquest followed a few simple rules, not invented, but rather elaborated by Genghis Khan and his successors at a time when economic growth and infrastructure in Eurasia had reached unrivaled levels compared to the Xiongnu or Huan Khanids. As with preceding steppe empires, local rulers could either follow his call for surrender or face submission and destruction. Those who surrendered in good time were offered positions. Those who came late were often regarded not reliable and positioned at the front edge of the battlefield. Then they were the first to attack their neighbors when the Mongol command decided to move on, a situation which local rulers would generally avoid at any rate and offer their timely alliance instead. But even then, they were obliged to provide troops, horses, food, and services to the Mongol army and collect taxes for the Khan, a burden that was compensated only in part by plunder and the spoils of war they could make themselves. The effects of this snowball dynamic have often been described in order to explain the rapid drive of empire building from the Mongolian to the Hungarian plains within little more than 3 decades, and rightly so. Indeed, the conquest into ever new territories and their subsequent exploitations by victorious auxiliary forces was a decisive factor. However, imperial overstretch was induced not by territorial expansion alone. Accelerating contradictions between core and peripheries, between culture continuity and change, as well as a weakening resilience of long-tested integration strategies, produced limitations of their own. All these backgrounds are very well documented in the historical records of the secret history, the Altan Topçi and Erdeniyin Topçi. The Oirat people, for example, who in 1201 still joined the Jamukha camp, but were among the few who submitted in good time, are a case in point. They entered the services of the state in 1207, contributing significantly to the empire building and received a privileged place among the tributary peoples. Rewarding the military merits of this cooperation, Genghis Khan made Hudukha Beki, the most prominent Oirat noble, his kinsman. He gave Huli Khan, the daughter of his eldest son Jochi, to Hudukha Beki, eldest sons Terelchi, whose younger brother Inalchi received his daughter Chicheken. Thanks for pointing this out. Thanks to these marriage alliances, which spread to other Borgigan lines in the following generations, the Oirats received a distinguished status. In the Mongol Empire, they now formed the left or eastern wing Zunga of the westernmost part of the empire. Please. Thank you. Being a prominent player also in post-Yuan times, the Oirats were among the first to engage in feudal warfare after the Mongol dynasty had collapsed in 1368 and to form an independent yet short-lived Khanate when, after Elbek Khagan's death in 1399, Turgon Taishi declared himself Khagan of all Mongols. While this account tells us much about the Mongol model of inclusive ethnicity and integration by difference as opposed to integration by sameness, typical for the modern nationalizing state, it also highlights some of its limitations, such as exclusive descent and the politics of kinship. Though various groups and individuals could achieve high positions in the imperial hierarchy by merits and awards, the affiliation with the Jingizid lineage, preferably by blood, lesser through marriage, remained the essential condition for the acquisition of political power. This has been called the Jingizid principle, which implied that only male descendants of Genghis Khan were entitled to call themselves Khan. However, this ultimately led to fierce succession wars and resulted in a very creative usage of genealogies. Hence, the Jingizid principle became dysfunctional over time and was replaced by the divine legitimation and authentication by the Dalai Lama with the reinvention of Buddhism in the late 16th centuries. Marriage alliances like fictive kinship, andanar, polygyny, adaptation, and the fusion of fission of clans were widely practiced principles in nomadic social organization for maintaining social and political mobility. However, what worked well on a communal basis in order to offer asylum and shelter to widows, war orphans, or refugees often became counterproductive when applied to society in imperial context. Polygyny caused unclear claims to power, spurring succession struggles among competing lineages. Marriage alliances, though frequently used as a reinforcing device bridging rivaling polities, often turned into a source of intrigue and conflict among the participating states. If we turn our attention now from social and cultural to spatial and economic mobility, the relations between expansion and conquest on the one hand and local governance and tribute relations on the other are quite obvious. In order to rule, the Mongols had to introduce check and balance systems at their peripheries. In order to tax local populations, tax collectors and census takers were needed. And in order to communicate with foreign powers in Asia and Europe, an expertise in foreign languages in diplomatic conventions was indispensable. To put it in a nutshell, the Mongols were able and flexible enough to combine and recombine the principles of their own political organization with institutions, practices, and inventions of the peoples they brought under their rule. They not only adapted to and learned from sedentary civilizations, but also hired foreign experience when needed and relocated populations and war prisoners for their own purposes, as was the case with farmers from Central Asia and China, German craftsmen from Transylvania, or carpenter and goldsmiths from Russia. As a result, the Pax Mongolica created a situation of intensified cultural transfer, traveling ideas, and an enhanced flow of goods in which all of its parts could participate. The empire thus acted as a mediator of cultural goods from China, Central Asia, and Persia for a highly ambitious elite, significantly shaping the cultural identity in Western Eurasia and the Slavia Azatia in particular. The Ulus Jochi, for instance, also known as the Golden Horde, located northwest of the Chagatai Khanate, designated the Kipchak language as the lingua franca of its newly subdued subjects for Volga Bulgarians and to some degree for the Rus as well. The Uyghur script applied for use in imperial bureaucracy by Genghis Khan was widespread until the Golden Horde's Islamization when it was replaced by Arabic writing. Official correspondence and decrees known as Yarlik represented translations from the Mongol into the Kipchak language written down in Uyghur. The Mongols introduced the supply and postal system Yam, whose stations enabled Plano Carpini to travel 3,000 miles within 105 days. They also introduced the Takhan privileges, an award for princely services and a tool for elite group building. And last but not least, the offices of Baskak and Daruga, the first designating a governor of an administrative territorial unit, the latter a tax collector or a commander, well known to the Russian medieval sources. Based on these inventions, their continental rule and integration strategies, the Mongols also arranged the terms of flow for commercial goods along the Silk Roads and spy routes for a long time. With territorial expansion coming to a close in the mid-13th century, falling incomes from heavily taxed populations and continuous financing of a military retinue, long-distance trade between Asia, Africa, and Europe became more and more important for the Genghis elites, initially combined in their interest in the free flow of commodities and the skimming of profits. To this end, they would guarantee the free and safe move of foreigners and caravans with their respective territories, the maintenance of communication and infrastructure, and thus considerably increase the conditions for mobility within the Pax Mongolica. However, to conclude, by the 14th century, the once symbiotic relationship between Khan and merchant had turned into a mutually dependent relation where the former granted protection and the latter financed the many skirmishes of the Genghis lineages who were competing now over Caucasian and Middle Asian trade revenues and trade control. Religious belonging now became a criteria for exclusion to privileged traders, and thus for higher tariffs on trade, paving the way for Islamization of the Golden Horde, which expanded the Silk Road from Urgench to Sarai to Tanais and Kaffa. Janibek's raids against Genovese and Venetian commercial settlements on the Crimea in 1343, as well as Tamerlane's destructions of trade centers in Sarai, Astrakhan, and Tanais in 1395, are striking examples of these conflicts. The loss of long-distance trade would generally result in the rapid collapse of the central power, illuminating again the limitations of mobility in the Pax Mongolica. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
I hope that everything was understandable. Я очень надеюсь, что все было понятно.
Да, спасибо большое за такой глубокий анализ и глубокий доклад. Было очень интересно. Я думаю, что сейчас мы включим вид галереи. И если у кого-то есть какие-то вопросы, то кто-то поднимет руку. Пожалуйста. Так. Тем временем у нас Баир присоединился. Вновь. Теперь уже с видео. Ага. Хорошо. Спасибо.
Пожалуйста.
Спасибо большое. Весьма интересно, да, эти интересные рассуждения. Я хотела в дополнение к вашему докладу сказать тоже, вот у нас недавно Базар Александрович выступал, Бичеев, и обращал внимание на местные передачи нашей калмыцкой, на такой факт, про политическую мобильность, что хан Аюкан, который был, при котором калмыцкое ханство достигло своего рассвета, он вообще был не только сыном представителей правящих домов Джунгарии и калмыцкого ханства, но до 13 лет находился там в Джунгарии, и Шукур Дайчин, когда находился, официально это было в длительных паломнических поездках, на самом деле, вот как Базар Александрович показал в своем докладе, он добивался возвращения своего внука на родную землю, в Калмыкию, откуда его увезла дочь Батурахонтайши. Да? Вот политическая мобильность, которая показывает связи между политическими элитами не только в ближайших кланах, но и в ближайших родственных кланах, отстоящих на тысячи километров. И это было возможно в условиях вот того кочевого общества, которое находилось в 17 веке, конечно, совсем в другом состоянии.
Спасибо, Эльза Петровна, за дополнение и замечание. Все
не замечание, а вот именно дополнение, потому что очень интересно. Спасибо большое.
Если я могу добавить коротко, конечно, вот это выходит из рамки, значит, доклада, который связан был с средневековым временем, но естественно, то, что калмыцкое ханство до того оно потеряло самостоятельность, являлся большим фактором и свободным фактором движения в политическом и географическом смысле, естественно, конечно.
Да, это важно, да, замечание.
И после 1971 года тоже не потерял все возможности сообщения с Тибетом, с Монголией и так далее. Как мы знаем и из предыдущих докладов товарищей, которые сказали нам о присутствии калмыцких инструкторов в Монголии в 20-х годах.
Да, и паломники, особенно паломники, конечно.
Есть паломники, есть другие. Да. Хорошо, спасибо.
Спасибо большое. Ну и у нас сейчас остается только один доклад, потому что наши коллеги из Ганчжоу не смогли выйти на связь, но статьи Нормандаха и Сантьяго Гамбаджава будут опубликованы в ближайшем номере журнала «Монголоведение». Вот они прислали раньше всех, и поэтому мы сможем ознакомиться с их материалами в журнале «Монголоведение», на сайте журнала «Монголоведение», в который приглашаем, как всегда, всех наших коллег публиковаться у нас в журналах. Все коллеги, которые меня слышат и которые меня не слышат, передайте им, пожалуйста, приглашение на журнал Oriental Studies и на журнал.
Интересно, как будет переведение на русском языке или на...
Мы публикуем на монгольском, калмыцком, русском и английском.
Все понятно.
К сожалению, не немецкий, но...
Нет, я уже привык.
Возможности. К сожалению, специалистов нет хороших, да. Но в журнале публикуются вот статьи на 4 языках, и эти статьи будут опубликованы на монгольском. Ну, теперь мой доклад.